All right, great. Welcome everybody to this AIMOS session. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on, which in my case is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and this land was never ceded. I encourage you to think about the Indigenous people wherever you are and think about ways that you can pay the rent. I choose to do that through paytherent.com.au, but there are a lot of different ways of doing that. I encourage you to think about your situation. So welcome to this keynote session. I'm very, very excited to get to introduce Julia Rohrer, who's going to be speaking to us today. And as I was preparing the introduction, I went through my old emails and direct messages with Julia. And so it was fun to kind of look back on just even my history with Julia as kind of a microcosm of the history of a lot of this reform movement in psychology. So my first email from Julia was when she confirmed she was going to attend the very first SIPS meeting in 2016. She was one of the 100 people to attend that meeting. Then after that, like most of my emails to and from Julia are me asking her to be a reviewer and her accepting my review request, which I think tells you something about how highly I think of Julia. And since then, it's just been such a pleasure to follow her work and her contributions to science, not just her published work, but also her tweets and her blogs. So she blogs as one of the 4 bloggers at the 100 CI, whose tagline is always confident, sometimes credible, which I love. And I think the biggest compliment I can give to anyone, and it's true of Julia, is that as I was looking through her research papers and some of her blog posts, I think you could design an entire graduate course syllabus just from work that Julia has published, and it would be a really stimulating, really educational seminar. And in fact, I really need to learn some of this stuff. You would learn about causal inference, which we'll hear about today, but also more generally longitudinal design and what we can answer with longitudinal studies, interaction effects, and all the complications with interpreting interaction effects, self-correction in science, including very concrete examples of self-correction, as well as, of course, the broader themes of transparency, rigor, credibility, reproducibility. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to you, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And thanks also to the organizers for inviting me. I'm super happy to be here and to talk about causal inference, a topic which I believe has been somewhat neglected excuse me, in discussions about how to improve psychological science. So you will see that I'll talk a lot about psychology here, mainly because it's the field I know best, and so I can most confidently criticize psychologists. So if I criticize them, it's only out of love for my own field. But I still hope that this talk will be interesting for audience members from other fields, and maybe there's some things that are also relevant in just across maybe the social sciences, the health sciences, and so on. So why would I say that causal inference is the elephant in the room? Well, first of all, if you pull up some PDF, like just some article from psychological research, and you like press Control F and you type causal and search for occurrences of the words, you will probably get 0 hits. So psychologists very, very rarely explicitly talk about causal inference, and sometimes it's quite astonishing because they will have a methods paper that talks about something that is clearly causal inference, and at best the term causal pops up in some footnote. So we rarely ever reference causal inference unless it is in papers about causal inference. But at the same time, if you think about it, large parts of psychological research are not experimental. And actually, I feel like it is getting more now that people realize, okay, for experiments, you need those really large sample sizes if your measures are noisy. So actually, people who used to do experimental work are now moving to non-experimental work. And of course, this is not only true for psychology, for the social sciences in general, but also parts of health sciences strongly rely on observational data. And actually, it's true for large parts of science in general. And so this usage of observational data has led to some roadblocks in developments that are meant to improve science. For example, there have been debates about how applicable pre-registration is to different types of analyses that are not the typical experimental study, but what if you run secondary analysis? What if your pre-registered analysis was suboptimal? There's a lot of discussion about these things. Another suggestion has been to do multiverse analysis. So you have all these data analytic decisions, and so you just run all combinations. But then in many cases, that raises the question of how these analyses can be interpreted and what the variability means. So what does it mean if you have observational data and you have all these model specifications and only some really make sense? Can you still interpret all the variability across model specifications? And lastly, a quite recent debate has been about the interpretation of many analyst approaches. So there's the idea that many different people analyze data and then you see where they arrive at different answers. And so recently there has been an exchange involving Brüderl and Ausburg, two sociologists, who were exactly making the point like, the questions, if they are causal inference questions, some analyses are just wrong, and maybe the question was underspecified if people did not try even to recover the same answer. And so it makes it kind of hard to say what these many analyst approaches actually do tell us. But so these are some roadblocks, I think, that have been encountered because there is that idea that it's all experimental, but then it doesn't quite work that way if people are working with different types of data. But what we also see is that because causal inference has been neglected, I think experimental studies have also suffered a bit. And of course, in experimental studies, you still do have causal inference problems. For example, one classic is mediation analysis. So there's the standard approach, and there's lots of articles arguing, oh, no, you can't do it that way. Yes, what was the mechanism? Don't expect an easy answer and so on. And yet people keep still doing it, and for some reason that literature and psychology criticizing mediation analysis is often a bit like just like separate from the actual causal inference literature that of course does discuss the issue of causal mediation analysis. And then a completely different debate that is taking place is like that weird debate. So can we generalize our findings and so on? And should we add statements of limits of generalizability and so on? And again, this isn't framed in terms of a causal inference discussion, but actually you could frame it as such, and maybe that's a productive way to tackle this because you can rely on work being developed elsewhere, but it's not how psychologists tend to think about it. Because we kind of also believe that causal inference, if you do experiments, it's maybe not that central. And so why does causal inference have this like special neglected status in psychology? I think it's probably historical reasons. And so here's the briefest history of causal inference in psychology. I'm not a historian. There's probably historians in the room. So I will keep that as short as possible so that I don't say anything embarrassing. So you probably do know this name, or maybe you don't. I actually don't know whether people know him. It's Wilhelm Wundt. And he founded the first modern institute for psychology in 1879. At Leipzig University. And if you had studied here in Leipzig, you would definitely know because every lecturer tells you again and again and again. And actually just this week, we renamed our institute after him. So Wundt was a physiologist, and his idea was to apply these methods to the human psyche. And that is why the institute was called the Institute for Experimental Psychology. So already at the beginning, there are these close ties between modern psychology as a new field and experimental psychology. So there is that notion that psychology, as it is done these days, is an experimental field, and that is still strongly represented in the way we train psychological researchers. So for example, here's what I learned about causal inference with observational data during my graduate and undergraduate training. Essentially, I just learned it's impossible. So I did learn a bit about, oh, there's confounding variables, but then it was like, okay, there's confounders. So you have to give up and just do an experiment instead. And then we do learn things about causal inference with experimental data. It's just not framed normally as causal inference, but it normally is something from the Campbell tradition. And so if you've taken a psychological research methods course, you're probably aware of that Campbell tradition through lists of threats to validity. So that is the tool being developed there. And I brought you a small example. So this is essentially a list of things that can go wrong with experiments. For example, there can be a mismatch of the treatment, and there can be differences in the recipients and differences in time and so on. And all of these things could render conclusions drawn from experimental studies invalid. And maybe one thing that may be interesting to note here, so because I tend to throw shade on these lists of threat to validity, but actually even the original list fully converges with modern causal inference framework. So if you look at the modern work on transportability of causal effects within the directed acyclic graph framework, pretty much all of the points have already been made in the original work by Campbell and colleagues. So it's not like something completely new. It's already in there in the Campbell work. And so you could think, oh, experimentalists in psychology already know everything they need to know about the transport of causal effects. But in practice, these lists are used in a certain spirit. And so there's a very nice paper by West and Thomas summarizing the approach to causal inference in psychology. And they cite Campbell that inferences are innocent until judged guilty for plausible reasons as determined through the scientific method of mutual criticism. So the idea is you can just make a claim, and then your critics can go through the list and point out flaws in your work, and then you move on, you counter their criticism, or maybe you strengthen your research design, and so on. So that's the basic idea of the Campbell tradition. You have that list, but then you have mutual criticism. So how does that scientific method of mutual criticism play out in practice? So I brought two case studies, one in which it seems to work in my opinion, and another one in which I believe it doesn't. So the first example is a recent article by the social psychologist Joe Cesario. So he asked, what can experimental studies of bias tell us about real-world group disparities? And so he addresses a certain type of lab study. Say you have a couple of undergraduate students and you show them pictures of potentially threatening interactions with others, and they have to press a button. And the idea is that this is like the decision whether they should or should not. And this is supposed to tell us something about, for example, racial bias in police shootings. And so supposedly these lab studies then inform us about why, for example, in the US, Black people are at a higher risk of being killed by the police. And he says those studies don't tell us much, we have been getting it wrong. And his argument has two parts. So the first part concerns the experimental studies. And so he argues that these studies are flawed in systematic ways. And he has a list of 3 flaws, and you could easily append them to any list of threats to validity. So this is in this particular spirit. And I think the flaws he brings up, they are a bit wonky in the way they are put, but they are essentially, I think, valid criticism of a certain type of lab studies. And I think that criticism is not particularly controversial. Some social psychologists felt quite attacked by it. But I think if you talk to people who are not social psychologists, if you explain them what the experiments look like, they will be like, oh yeah, sure, there's obvious issues with these setups. So that is the first part, so that's in the Campbell tradition. But then comes the more controversial part. So Cesario writes that it is also the case that violent crime rates differ very starkly across racial groups. Indeed, recent work suggests that the different rates of exposure to police through violent crime situations greatly, if not entirely, accounts for the overall per capita disparities in being fatally shot by the police. So this is bringing in observational data to make a point about these lab studies. And there's that little phrase in there. It accounts for the disparities. And it's a very typical psychologist phrase. And what does that actually mean here? Because the way it's put, it could be like a purely statistical claim. This variable accounts for this association. But of course, in the context of this argument, it is a causal claim. So what he's essentially saying is that people who are Black are more likely to be involved in crime, and people who are criminal are more likely to be shot by the police. And he's actually making a claim about mediation. The effect of race on being shot by the police is partially or fully mediated through involvement in crime situations. And it's never spelled out explicitly as this causal mediation claim, but of course it's right in there. Otherwise, the whole argument does not make much sense. And I think like this ambiguity in language, that it's a purely statistical claim, but it cannot be read statistically, that is just like one way that psychologists deal with that correlation does not equal causation thing when they do try to draw on observational data, and I will talk a bit more about that later. So, but like I said before, so mediation analysis is like a classic, and you can't do mediation analysis like this. You can't just throw violent crime rates into the model and then see that it disappears and they say, okay, yeah, the mediator was violent crime rates. And like I said before, this is actually the scenario in which I believe that psychologists' innocent until proven guilty approach works. because this substantive topic, of course, sparked a huge outrage. So there was a large number of people immediately pointing out how Cesario got things wrong here. And that actually includes us. So we did write a commentary. And so we summarized his list of flaws, and essentially these are, I think, valid points that can be addressed through better experimental design. And in the second part, we really just tried to explain why mediation really does not work that way. And you just can't control for violent crime rates and think you will get the indirect and direct effects. But we also try to make that like more meta point, that lists of threats to validity make it just really convenient to apply double standards, because it's easy to point out the causal inference errors other people commit, but you still kind of remain blind to the causal inference errors in your own reasoning. And you might not even realize that you're just doing the same mistake because you're not even working in a consistent causal inference framework to begin with. So it's really easy to miss your own mistakes in that framework. But like I said, I think this is the best case scenario for the threats of validity mindset, because there are people involved in this debate who are really eager to defend their viewpoint, to work for or against certain narratives and counter narratives and so on. So you will always find people putting in the effort to point out errors on the other side. But now most of psychological research is just not that polarizing. And so that is my second example. This is a study called Having Too Little or Too Much Time is Linked to Lower Subjective Well-Being. And it's essentially a study that claims that having too much free time is bad for you. And so this is the novel claim, that having too little free time is bad is probably uncontroversial. The other part is more interesting. And I'm picking on this study in particular because in many ways it does embody what is currently deemed best practices in our field. So it's published in a top journal, it's well written. The authors are actually committed to transparently reporting their results, and I generally believe that they are trying hard to answer the question as best as possible. So I'm picking that one because it's doing many things right and still probably misses some central concerns. So this claim that having too much time is linked to lower subjective well-being is supported by observational data. What you can see here on the x-axis is the amount of free time that people have. And on the y-axis, you can see people's self-reported subjective well-being. And if you look at the plot, and I'm happy the plot is in there, it was probably a reviewer demanding that, it already looks a bit wonky. So if you just look at the number of people who report 20 hours of discretionary time, and I think this does not include sleep here, there must be some insomniacs, unemployed insomniacs in this data set, or something else is going on there. So the authors move on and additionally adjust for a host of third variables. So we have to assume that they are indeed trying to identify the causal effect of free time on subjective well-being in these observational data. And if you take that serious as an attempt of causal inference, you have to ask yourself, okay, what effect are you actually trying to identify there? Because they present this inverted U shape, so that implies that they are interested in the causal effect of free time across the whole range. So if you succeeded at the identification here, you could take somebody with 0 hours of free time and use the model to tell them how happy they would be if they had 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 hours of free time. And you already can, like, if you think about that for yourself, like think of yourself and putting yourself in a situation where you have 20 hours of free time. Maybe that's not the most plausible counterfactual that you could actually recover from observational data. So if you were doing that as an explicit causal inference exercise, you'd probably notice that it is just preposterous to begin with the aim of the analysis. You can't even come up with a hypothetical intervention that makes sense here. But these analyses are never explicitly presented as an attempt of causal inference. And I think if pressed, the authors would probably not claim that they were trying to identify the causal effect, because nobody in psychology claims to try to identify causal effects with the help of observational data. So it's more something like, oh no, we are just trying to provide empirical evidence supportive of the benefits and risks of discretionary time. And what you will find in psychology is a lot of creative phrasing. So here's a brief digression. Right, so psychologists don't like to talk about causal effects when they use observational data, and they are setting something up something that we call a Mott and Bailey argument. So the whole article, when you read it, and this is not about this particular paper, but more like a genre of papers, the whole article screams X has a causal effect on Y. It's the only reading that makes sense. And it's the only reason why the article would be interesting to begin with. Nobody gets excited about robust confounding due to social demographic factors. But the authors know that causal inference on the basis of observational data is not admissible. And so they prepare everything for a strategic retreat to, oh no, it's just X predicts Y. So they will use lots of non-causal language. They will say things like X predicts Y even after accounting for, and they will definitely add a paragraph, oh, but this is merely correlational. Future experimental study need to validate this, etc. So when confronted with criticism, they can always retreat to a purely statistical treatment. No, you misread our study. We were really careful about this. We added this additional paragraph. And I do find this style of article and argumentation deeply unsatisfying because it makes it extremely hard to criticize articles productively. And for the author, this means that they get away with causal claims without the scrutiny you should get if you're trying to make causal claims. So I find this deeply frustrating. And now I keep bashing psychologists. So first of all, I believe this is a workaround to deal with the contradictory requirements in our field. We really need to tell interesting stories. Causal effects are the thing that is most interesting, but we are never allowed to draw causal conclusions from observational data. So what do you do with that? Well, you come up with some like sophisticated style of article that is just like in the ambiguity zone that you get away with both things. And second, I don't believe that this is limited to psychology. So I was involved in a large-scale language review led by Noah Haber, and we reviewed the language of 1,000 observational health studies. And normally these studies are interested in the effect of an independent variable, an exposure, on a dependent variable, something like survival, for example. And so what we try to do is code the central sentence linking the two variables. So for example, exposure to lead is associated with the increase in all-cause mortality. And in health research, there's a very strong norm that causality cannot be claimed outside of a RCT, outside of a randomized controlled trial. So indeed, if we code the language of these studies, we do find the most frequently used linking phrase is that X is associated with Y and variations of that. So you could say, oh, this is actually all fine. People are only using the statistical language. But we also went on and rated whether the whole sentence implies causality or not. And if you just look at that human assessment, does this imply causality? And then it turns out that more often than not, these articles do imply causality, at least weakly, if not even strongly so. And again, we have that ambiguity. So strictly speaking, the language is not causal, but it very much evokes a causal interpretation. And we coded more properties of the studies. So many of them were motivated by causal research questions. Many adjusted for confounders, which is a causal concept. So it also tells you, okay, they were trying to do causal inference. And in the end, some of the studies drew policy implications that definitely required causal inference had happened at some point, except it never explicitly happened. It happened somewhere between the lines. So causal inference on the basis of observational data does involve a lot of uncertainty. And so you could imagine that this uncertainty is applied to the interpretation of the effect estimate of interest. So you could be, we estimate that X has an effect of 7 percentage points. However, due to unobserved confounding, this could be no estimate, for example. But this is not what happens. What happens instead is that the uncertainty is applied to the goal of the study. So here's our estimate. Maybe this is just a statistical prediction. Maybe the statistical prediction coincides with the causal effect. Who can know that, right? And of course, in health research, I believe it's even clearer that whatever you write and no matter how much heading you add to your article, if this ever gets picked up by the press, it will probably interpret it causally. So there's no like plausible deniability at this point anymore. So that was my digression. Back to the question whether having too little or too much time is linked to lower subjective well-being. Of course, the authors are aware of the limitations of observational data, and so they actually do run an experiment to provide causal evidence for the inverted U-shape. And so they do an experiment in which people are prompted to imagine that over the course of 6 months, every day they have the following amounts of discretionary time: 50 minutes, 3.5 hours, or 7 hours. And then they are supposed to say how they would feel in that scenario, and they are supposed to imagine it really vividly and so on. And what you can see on this plot is that if people imagine to have a lot of free time that they spend on non-productive activities, then they say they'd be unhappier. So, and if you think about that whole experimental setup, at least to non-social psychologists, it should be quite obvious that this probably does not at all inform us about the effects of having too much or too little time on well-being. Like the additional assumptions that are necessary to transport this thought experiment to the real world are just really, really, really strong. But at the same time, hey, it's an experiment, so it's innocent until proven guilty, and it is causal evidence after all. And so again, I'm picking on this author, but this style of experiment is surprisingly common in the literature, and this one is definitely not the worst one I've seen. And again, I believe that this is something that has evolved to deal with the fact that psychologists say that causation does require experimentation. So if you're dealing with something that can't be manipulated that easily, you'd rather do an implausible experiment than try to think of other ways to estimate the causal effect. And I already said before, I don't believe that the innocent until proven guilty mindset will work for this particular study. And why is that? Well, there is a lot of things about the inference happening here that one could easily criticize. And if you think about it, this topic is right up my alley. I'm doing well-being research. I do causal inference. So maybe I should write a commentary. So am I going to write a formal critique of this paper? Actually, at this point, the answer is not, probably not. The answer is most definitely not. Why not? So first of all, writing something like a commentary just takes an immense amount of effort. So the authors do have all that hedging in the article. And so I need to acknowledge that first to appear charitable. But then second, I would need to provide additional analyses, at least if I want to respond in the same journal because it's JPSB and they don't do commentaries. So third, I might end up with a reviewer whose career is very much built on this style of research because it's so common. So that combination of observational data plus a certain style of experiment. And I don't think those people would be very happy if I raise like a very general criticism of this style of research. And fourth, life is short. The paper is doing many things right. So why should I be the asshole about it and just point out mistakes that everybody else does? And so I believe many people have been in similar situations with similar papers. You know that there's all these problems. You know that somebody should probably point them out, and you still just can't get yourself to write a commentary because it's such a hassle. And so I think the innocent until proven guilty idea just puts so much demands on critics. And so many times the critics just won't spell it out because it's such a hassle. So what do these dynamics mean? I believe it leads to the accumulation of essentially uninformative studies. And I think there might be quite a lot of these in the literature. And these are just accumulating, not vertically in the sense of cumulative science, but just horizontally. They are just coexisting there. And then if at some point you're maybe a grad student and you want to dive into a particular topic, you have to wade through the mess that is the literature. And at least for me personally, that is super aversive because I just want to like write a nice introduction that does justice to the research that has been done. But normally it escalates to the point where I feel like I have to write a methods paper about like the things happening in those studies. But of course that keeps me from doing my own research, which might be better than the previous studies, but I still need to engage with them. And I think the worst of it is that it leads to an immense waste of time and talent, because I do believe that people can do better studies, and I do believe that we can spend our time better than wading through the messy literature. So I think we are stuck with a certain style of study that gets rewarded, that gets into the best outlets, but that generally does not tell us much. And now the question is, can we do better, or how could we do better, or how do we get people to do better? Because this style of study, I think, still works fairly well. So one thing I noticed while working on that language review and coding abstract was that I noted that the abstracts in the health sciences were mostly structured. So there was a clear section on the study objective or study goal, and there was a clear section describing the central finding. And that made coding super easy, because there was always like that one sentence where you could like write down what the authors thought about the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. And actually, in the mix of studies I had to code, there were 2 unstructured abstracts. I think one was from psychology and one was from economics. And it was an absolute mess trying to pin down which sentence was the what we call linking sentence, because they were just really verbose, talking about the importance of this and that for some vague outcome. So I think that aligns with the experience that many people who have tried to code things for meta-science studies have made. It's often extremely hard to figure out what exactly the authors are trying to do. And couldn't we do something about that? Couldn't we use this idea of structured abstracts? So here's my pitch. I would suggest that we demand that every abstract includes the following 2 sections. One section is the theoretical estimand, and the second section is the identification strategy with assumptions. So let's unpack that, because I haven't brought up the theoretical estimand before. So there is a wonderful article by a group of sociologists, and the first author was just a grad student when writing this. And so I will just quote from the abstract. We make only one point in this article. Every quantitative study must be able to answer the question, what is your estimand? The estimand is the target quantity, the purpose of the statistical analysis. Much attention is already placed on how to do estimation. A similar degree of care should be given to defining the things we are estimating. We advocate that authors state the central quantity of each analysis, the theoretical estimand, in precise terms that exist outside of any statistical model. So the central idea is here that we need a theoretical estimand. And the theoretical estimand consists of 2 parts. So first of all, we got a unit specific quantity. So for pure description, for example, it might just be like, I want to describe a population's well-being. So the variable of interest is an individual's well-being, or the amount of discretionary time somebody has. For causal inference, the estimand would look different. It would be the difference between 2 potential outcomes. So for example, my well-being at the end of the day, if I had had 5 hours of free time, versus my well-being at the end of the day, if I had had 6 hours of free time. And actually, if you try to do it for that time example, you will already like run into some problems. Okay, wait, if I have 1 more hour of free time, does it mean like my day gets 1 more hour? Does it mean I work 1 hour less and so on? And you already notice that when you try to spell that out, you need to specify what you're actually trying to do with your analysis. And the second part, besides the unit specific quantity, is the target population. So for example, we could try to make a statement about the general US population. But we could also try to make a statement among certain working people in a certain nation at a certain time, and so on. And so this kind of subsumes that idea of statements of limits of generalizability, because it's baked into the estimand. So then the counterpart to the theoretical estimand is the empirical estimand. And we need some identification strategy to ensure that the empirical estimand, which we are actually estimating from the data, actually recovers the theoretical estimand of interest. And this identification strategy will always rest on assumptions that we can normally spell out. And just to give you a few examples, this could look something like this. Our analysis identified the estimate of interest under the assumptions that, for example, for the discretionary time study, it would be, there are no factors that influence both discretionary time and subjective well-being apart from gender, age, parental and employment status, if these are your control variables. Of course, many people in psychology also do longitudinal data analysis. And for these, there's also assumptions under which they do recover causal effects. For example, there are no time varying confounders that affect X and Y, and past values of Y do not affect current values of X. That is like the version for the fixed effects model. Of course, experiments also have identification strategies, and that is not really talked about in this sociology piece because they are sociologists. But you could think about something like, there are no systematic differences in potential effect modifiers between the lab situation we created and the situation of interest. So you could expand that notion of identification strategy to accommodate experimental studies. And so these are just the assumptions, but I would maybe add a bonus requirement if I could just wish for whatever I wanted to. And that would be that authors are supposed to list one plausible violation. So right now, limitation sections of journal articles to me often feel like a joke. It's like you're inviting somebody over to your place and your whole house is on fire and you're like, oh, I'm so sorry I didn't do the dishes. That is really embarrassing. And so often I feel it's just throwing stuff at readers to distract them from the obvious problem, because listing serious limitations is kind of self-defeating. And I would really like it if we made it a norm that you list like one really bad plausible violation and actually reward authors for doing that. So I try to do that when I review papers. So that is the idea I'm envisioning. And of course, there's now a host of potential problems with this. And I think the first one that we run into is that many authors may have no idea what their estimand actually is. And I think that is not a bug, it's a feature of this idea, because I believe authors have to put in the work to clarify what they are even trying to do. And this is not something that critics can do for them. It is not something that mutual criticism can solve. And it also very much aligns with other recent calls. So for example, my friend Anne Scheel and colleagues, they have a paper why hypothesis testers should spend less time testing hypotheses, which makes similar point. And there have also been calls for more theory, more formal modeling that all aligns with that idea that people really need to know what they are trying to do. So all of these calls are clearly aligned, they just emphasize different aspects. And maybe more critically, if both reviewers and editors don't know which identification strategies make which assumptions, and it can just become a meaningless formality. So you throw in some tame assumptions and hope that nobody asks for more. And the reviewers, I mean, they are like really busy anyway, so they are probably not going to note that. Right, alternatively, you could argue, but there's an endless number of auxiliary assumptions going into every type of research. And I was like, yes, that is true. I also feel that in many situations, it's beyond the point, because for many common identification strategies, there are certain central assumptions, which we assume to be central according to current knowledge. And yes, of course, we could find out that there are some other hidden assumptions, but there would just be scientific progress. So asking for theoretical estimates and identification strategies is not going to fix all problems, and it's not going to like result in perfect studies. I do believe it could lead to incremental improvements. But for reviewers to be able to assess these identification strategies and estimates, we need to build resources. And also, of course, for authors, because if they are confronted with this particular demand, then they need a way to actually put in the work productively. So I think part of this would just be like, we need some articles breaking down the assumptions of common statistical methods for a broad audience. And these are surprisingly hard to find. So I just wrote something about longitudinal data analysis, and wading through the statistical literature on that it's really hard to find out what people are actually trying to say and which assumptions go into the model, because we don't talk about causal inference explicitly, not even in the literature on longitudinal modeling. So we need these articles so that people can actually learn to understand what assumptions go into their statistical analyses. But I think we will also just need a lot of worked examples. So what are common estimates? How would you define them? What would common identification strategies look like? And so the what is your estimate paper actually already contains a lot of that, but it's written for a different audience, for sociologists. And so it would need a lot of translation and also expansion to accommodate psychological studies. And we would already also need to cover measurement and so on, which is often neglected in the causal inference literature. So I'm aware that my suggestion would imply just a lot of labor for the field collectively. And more importantly, I think it would sort of enforce major rethinking. Because right now in psychology, but also in other fields, we really like to put the statistical cart before the substantive horse. So we do like to do all these fancy analyses, regardless of whether they actually map onto the thing we are interested in. And so what I'm suggesting is reversing the process, and I believe that will take a lot of unlearning, at least for some people in the field. At the same time, I do believe it's a worthy goal, because I think it is mostly uncontroversial to demand that every study has a clear objective. If you ask people, should a study have a clear objective? Well, duh, of course. That is whatever the objective is. So for example, an objective could be exploration, but proper exploration also demands clarity, maybe even more so than more typical types of research. And right now, it looks more like strategic ambiguity about the study objective is being rewarded. Furthermore, I do believe that it's also uncontroversial to demand that people understand the assumptions underlying their interpretation of their statistical models. I think our current training does not really aim for this type of understanding. And I do believe that part of that is that, so we are very lucky in that we have a subfield that is developing psychological methods. That's actually a huge advantage, but that field has its own incentives. And I think they are also partly dysfunctional, because if you're a methodologist, you want many people to use your method. You don't get people to use your method by being very explicit about the many assumptions that necessarily go into any sort of inference. So I think it is uncontroversial that clarity ought to be the norm. And I just believe that we need to actually make it happen. So we just need to move toward a culture that rewards clarity and awareness of assumptions, rather than rewarding that ambiguity in those dazzling fancy stats. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer all of your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Julia. That was fantastic. And Matt, maybe we could allow everyone to unmute and turn on their videos if they want, so that if they want to ask a question, they have various options. So you can put your question in the chat if you'd like, or feel free to raise your hand and then unmute and share and turn on your video if you'd like when you ask your question. I'll kick it off with a question. So I think you're talking to a lot of people who work on meta research, and many of us are probably collecting observational data right now about research practices, for example. And I suspect we're going to want to make a lot of causal claims, or, we're like, just speaking for myself, for example, we're tracking change over time, and it's going to be slippery, I think. Even if we say we're just making descriptive claims, like surely we have hypotheses about maybe the effects of reforms or different things that might have caused changes over time. And I think some of us, like me, are probably not equipped to do this well. So do you have any advice specifically for those of us in meta science, meta research, who are going to be dealing with this problem of trying to understand the causes of change over time in research practices, for example?
Yes, so this is a very good point. It's also a bit of a pet peeve of mine, right? And so there was a paper looking at the effects of implementing badges. And of course, that is causal inference on the basis of observational data. And so I think for these particular things like change over time, many times you can treat policy changes in some sense as natural experiments. And there's like a huge literature in both economics and political science. And like huge, like also like there's a huge debate just about how to investigate this pre-post policy change interventions and so on. So I do think there is a lot of work that one could draw on, but I think because many meta scientists are coming from like psychology and so on, they might not be that aware of this literature. So I guess my recommendation would maybe even to just team up with economists and political scientists, if you can find some who are willing to work with you, because they really have, some of them really have like great expertise to these designs, with these designs.
Great, thanks, that's really helpful. I could keep talking to Julia all day, so someone's gonna have to stop me. Jump in with a question if you have one, otherwise I have another one lined up. Anyone want to jump in? All right, I'll keep going. So actually, one of the people in the audience is my student, Beth Clark, who gave a talk earlier today about setting limitations in papers. And so we were messaging about what you were saying, that we're counting like the number of limitations in papers and which validity are they about and things like that. And one of the things we try to say in our write-up of it is that, of course, it's not necessarily a good thing to list more limitations. And what you were saying, I think it resonates a lot with me, that, and sometimes I find myself doing this as an author, where I'll be like, okay, what's the first limitation? Okay, how do we respond to that? Okay, moving on to the next one, when really the first one is so damning that we should just really sit with it and like not move on, And so I'm curious, yeah, how can we, and I've sometimes seen the papers I've seen that are the best example of this are actually philosophy papers, so experimental philosophers who write papers that look like psychology papers, so I might have come across them, but they criticize themselves kind of like I would expect philosophers to, and so their entire discussion section is like basically taking on the role of a critic and then answering, kind of having a back and forth with their imaginary critic. Yeah, so I'm curious, A, how we can incentivize that. B, like, do you have any concrete tips or steps about how to get from here to there? Because I agree with you, we're so far from that. The kinds of limitations we see in papers right now are not seriously grappling with.
Yeah, so for how to incentivize that, I do believe to some extent it's also, right, it is a culture thing, I think, to some extent, right? So we don't have that culture where we rigorously criticize each other that much, right, which philosophy has, but I think also econ has to a degree, whether it's maybe getting counterproductive. So I do believe it's a cultural thing, and I'm not sure how to best change that cultural aspect. It's just what I'm trying as a reviewer is to really communicate with authors. Is like, I want to see your strongest limitations spelled out clearly. If you spell them out, you don't need to refute them. You don't need to convince me that they are not an issue. I just want to see them. And so, because right now I'm often like, as a reviewer, I'm telling you, please just write down the assumptions going into your causal inferences. I don't mind if they are ridiculous, because they often are. I'm fine with that. Please just tell me. And still, authors are often reluctant to put in the assumptions because we are so much trained to believe that any limitation that you put in there is going to get reviewers to reject it because they say the claim is less plausible. And so what I'm currently trying to do is decouple that assessment. Are the assumptions plausible? I just want to see the assumptions. If they are spelled out, any reader can assess it for themselves and can say, well, this claim is just plainly ridiculous. So I'm trying to decouple that. I think that could be institutionalized maybe in the review process, or just like added to checklists and so on. But also we definitely need to just teach reviewers that these assumptions are not weaknesses, because that idea really incentivizes hiding the assumptions, right? You don't want to give your reviewers bad ideas. Now, I do have that mindset myself. I don't want to like get them to reject the paper because I do want to publish as well. And I really think we need to get away from that. Yeah, so I think peer review is the part where the change needs to happen. I don't know how to best get there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have more to say, but I'm going to turn it over to Matthew, who I think has a question too.
Hi, thanks for a fantastic presentation, Julia. I think you're too kind to the observational epidemiologists as well. I think we do just as poorly, or maybe worse. But I liked the suggestion about the things you recommended be included in an abstract to help improve interpretation. But I think, I guess a common criticism I imagine you might expect from that is there's just not enough space to put all of that in the abstract. Have you considered sort of in your work maybe trying to sort of demonstrate through examples of rewriting abstracts how one could actually convey all this additional information on top of all the other minimum recommended things that one would include? And I mean, I agree that these things are important to convey. It's just, I can imagine some people feeling like, oh, can I actually put that in 250 words?
So yeah, no, I do believe it is really hard, and also depending on the journal you're going for, they want the theoretical background and so on in great detail. So I think at that point, so I think I'm trying to do that in my own work. It is kind of hard to also keep the abstract crisp, right? Because we do want to keep it short. And maybe there could be an idea that we split it into like, just like a verbose abstract. So that's the normal stuff you write, that is just like the text, but then maybe have like a second that is just like a text box, right? That is just like a structured abstract. And then you would have both. And then, of course, people will have different preferences. Maybe most people are just going to read like the more literary abstract, but the information would be there in the other abstract. And importantly, the authors they have to put the information in, so they can't just wing it. And maybe that could be a solution. And then maybe other people would just read actually like the summary, right? This is the estimand, this is the strategy, and so on. I could actually imagine that happening. Yeah, I think we might need to get creative, because currently if you have like a 150 words abstract, good luck fitting everything in and still making it entertaining enough for psychological science.
Thanks. Any other questions? So I'm going to take this opportunity. When I was reading back through our messages, one of the exchanges we had, Julia, was about the paper you wrote about the taboo against causal inference, or causal language. And so what you were saying just now reminded me of my objection to some of the claims in that paper. So I'm going to take this opportunity to raise them, which is, so this is related. So you mentioned that, reviewers shouldn't hold it against authors if they explicit or transparent about their assumptions and those assumptions are ridiculous. And that reminds me of other pushes for transparency where we've said, okay, well, no one else is sharing this information, so people who share it should be rewarded and not penalized. But we always intended to move the goalposts, right? Like once it becomes normal to be transparent about that, once everybody's sharing that information, then of course we're going to judge you based on what that transparency reveals, right? And is that the case here too? Or we don't want to promise in the long term we're not going to penalize you for having ridiculous assumptions once we're comparing you to other people who are also transparent about their assumptions and their assumptions are less ridiculous, right? So as an editor or reviewer, if everyone was sharing assumptions, wouldn't I be harsher on people whose assumptions were more ridiculous?
So yes, but so the point is, where is this supposed to happen, right? Is this supposed to happen during the review process? Or do we want to actually do that mutual criticism thing, but just provide more fodder upfront for the mutual criticism? And so right now, but that is because of the state of our field, I'm more like erring on the side of, okay, you can get things out with ridiculous assumptions because first of all, we need to establish an awareness for the assumptions. And then what comes after that, so to be honest, I'm not worrying about this currently. But yeah, I do believe, so some assumptions might be so ridiculous that it would be also irresponsible to let it, the study pass into the literature. So I think it will always be part of it. I just think we should like de-emphasize it currently to really get people into that mindset that you need to have to spell out assumptions first. Yeah. And then later on, yeah, of course, if the pre-registration is shoddy, right, it kind of looks suspicious and so on. But right now, because the reward is the publication, maybe do the next step post-publication. And even then, it's kind of like, it's a curse of transparency, right?
Yeah. No, I think it's a really interesting question about what's the best strategy to encourage transparency when you have a kind of double-headed message where one is like transparency is better than no transparency, period, right? Like someone who's upfront about their assumptions, it's always better than someone who's not. So we shouldn't penalize them for being transparent if that means choosing people who aren't transparent over that. But then once there's a level playing field with transparency, then the content of that becomes relevant.
But I think until then, to get there, we need to like heavily penalize that strategic ambiguity that you see in so many spaces in psychology.
Yeah. Great, we have a question in the chat. So can you compare and contrast these estimand and assumption statements to constraints and generality statements?
Yeah, that is a very good point. So I believe that the constraints on generality idea, so it hugely overlaps. So there are many things already in there that would be like kind of redundant if you additionally demand for the estimand. I believe with those constraints on generality and so on, the thing is, it's always kind of like a negative statement. So we do not want to generalize to that. We only want to generalize to that and so on. It's like that threads of validity reasoning once again. And so I think what's a slight different in framing is that with the estimand, you're like affirming to what you do want to generalize. And then you move on to licensing assumptions under which you can do that generalization. So there is a paper by the people who do the work on transport, and they really clearly spell out that they want to move from like threads to licensing assumptions. And so it's just like a rephrasing. I do believe that the statements to constraints on generality could do a lot of heavy lifting already. So I'm not opposed to that idea at all. And I think it actually would work nicely. Like, I mean, of course, you could still add like a constraint on generality statement, like just one sentence below all the other things as well, if we're already doing structured abstracts.
Great, thanks. Any other questions or thoughts about? Yeah, Jason.
Hey, Julia, nice to meet you finally.
Nice to meet you.
Been following you on Twitter for a long time. Yeah, I really loved your talk. Thanks again. And when you were talking about the paper where there was the not enough free time versus a lot of free time, I was thinking, I'm certain they used the word converging evidence at some point in this discussion. And yeah, it happens to me a lot where you read a paper where there's like 7 studies, they're all flawed in a different way. And you're like, oh, it's just not worth getting into this. And it just becomes more misleading because you have so many studies, you're like, oh, it's just numerically, it's convincing. this is kind of a silly idea, but is there an argument for like limiting the number of studies in a paper? Just like if you can't convince me in 3 studies, don't bother.
Yeah, so I think this goes towards the idea of triangulation. And I mean, these studies are effectively trying to provide triangulation. And I do believe triangulation is a very valuable idea. But for triangulation to work, we need to ensure that the biases that affect any single study, they are not all the same, they are not aligned. And so I do believe if the biases are all aligned, you can do 100 studies and make like a super convincing case, and it's all flawed in the same manner. And so, for example, I, together with Rich Lucas, I wrote a paper on the literature that supposedly proves that being happier makes you healthier. And they are essentially, all of the studies are suffering from the same issue. Is just so heavily confounded in a particular way that you can't get at it easily. So I do believe that is like where you get like that wrong, strong impression that is a really good study. But then if you had a study where actually any of the sub-studies can rule out one potential important confounder alternative explanation, then of course more studies would always be better. So I do think like right now we got like a bastardized version of triangulation. And that is because we are so unaware of these assumptions and we never spell them out. And I think at that point where you added them to every single study, then you could really, you would be in a better position to assess, do these additional studies add anything, or just reiterating the same biases? And then if it's just the same bias over and over again as a reviewer, you'd probably say, no, this can't go anywhere. Even if you add 10 more studies that do this particular thing, it's not going anywhere.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, it reminds me the idea that maybe there needs to be like one fundamental study that everything else is kind of trying to address potential criticisms of that study, rather than a bunch of patchwork studies, none of which are really central or hold up under close scrutiny. It reminds me also what you were saying about the limitation section. Maybe it'd be better if there was one central limitation, or I think a long time ago I had suggested a most damning result for people who don't want to deal with like multiverse analyses or whatever. Just tell us like the worst result of all the ones you tried. I think those kinds of strategies of like, you can obscure so much with complexity. So like asking authors to boil it down to what's your best evidence and what's your worst, most biggest threat, I think is an interesting question to ask of almost any paper. Any last questions, thoughts, reactions? We're basically out of time anyway. So with that, I'll say thank you so much, Julia, for a fantastic talk. I'm really excited that this will be posted online and other people will get to hear it too. And thanks for all the work you do for science and meta-science.
Oh, thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Will there be anything else in here now? No.
I don't know if there's anything in here. I think there are sessions now. I don't know if any of them are at this link.
There is a there's a
yes,
workshop.
there is.
Same link. Hello.
Okay.
Hi, there's a workshop. I'll stop my video. There's a workshop in this same link. It's a mini repro hack.
Great.